All right, I want to start off by giving all praises to Yahweh, Ba'ashem, Yahweh Shai, Ba'ashem, Wahar, Rakak, Wadash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone who teach and rule well. Peace, blessings, and salutations to the hopeful elect. All right, this is just a quick article I want to get into from the NewYorkTimes.com, and it's titled Ship of Horror, Discovery of the Last Slave Ship to America Brings New Hope to an Old Community. And may I remind you that this is the so-called last slave ship. So without any further ado, let's get into the article. This here is a picture of a woman. It reads, the Africa Town neighborhood was founded after the Civil War by people who had been transported on the Clotilda. And the Africa Town is a little town in the city of Mobile, Alabama. You know, some may call it Mobile, some may call it Mobile, Alabama, but us down here we call it Mobile, Alabama. It says the Africa Town neighborhood was founded after the Civil War by people who had been transported on the Clotilda, and the Clotilda is the so-called last slave ship that came to the Americas. It says the last slave ship to reach the United States. Thelma Mabin Owens, director of a local community garden, took photos of her family's graves at the old Plateau Cemetery. And Plateau is a little town inside of Africa Town. And this story is by Richard Fawcett, May 26, 2019. So as you can see, it's recent. It says Mobile, Alabama. Like nearly everyone who grew up in Africa Town, Felice Harris had heard the origin story of her little Alabama neighborhood, passed around from relative to relative and house to house. It was the story of a group of West Africans, and we are not Africans. You know, we are the Hebrew Israelites that the Bible talk about that went into slavery, you know, after Moses gave the decree. You know, he told the children of Israel, if you listen to the Lord thy God, you shall be blessed upon all measure. But if you won't listen to him, you know, you're going to go back into slavery and captivity again on ships. You know, because the first time they walked into Egypt, you know, they didn't go into Egypt on slave ships the first time. They walked into Egypt the first time. But this here is a second Egypt, spiritual Egypt, you know. And he says in the scripture that thou shalt go into bondage again, just roughly paraphrasing, bondage again on ships. You know, there you shall be sold to your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen. That's in the book of Deuteronomy 28 and 68. So reading on, it says, it was the story of a group of West Africans carried to Alabama on the last slave ship to reach the United States after the Civil War. They established and governed a thriving community of their own. Miss Harris, a retired kindergarten teacher, knew that the story of the ship and its human cargo was well documented by historians, and she told it to her students each year. But she occasionally wondered how much myth had seeped into the history because the ship, which was said to have been burned and sunk in the waters nearby, had never been found. Last week, all such doubts evaporated. A team of researchers confirmed that a submerged wooden wreck lodged in the mud a few miles up the river, and that's the Mobile River, from the African Town settlement was almost certainly the Clotilda, the schooner that had carried the 110 kidnapped Africans to Alabama from what is now the nation of Benin in 1860. And after this video, you know, Lord willing that it lasts this long, you know, I'm gonna get a video from their elder brother Kazak from the Mississippi camp. You know, he's gonna explain it a little bit, you know, further. So reading on. This was as the Africa Town neighborhood of Mobile, Alabama lost jobs and residents in recent years. Most of its businesses closed. A former convenience store sits abandoned. So that was one of the convenience stores. It says historians lauded the discovery as a crucial missing piece of the broader American story in Africa Town, a semi-isolated clutch of cottages 3 miles north of downtown Mobile. The news carried a particular kind of health. Something physical, something measurable was now attached to the tale they had heard all their lives. Quote unquote, now it's like letting us know that it's really real, said Miss Harris, 58. It's real. While it is too soon to say whether the Clotilda will be raised or restored, and if it is, where exactly it will go, the people of Africa Town are already dreaming that the ship's bones will reside with them, serving as a key not only to the past but to the future, attracting tourists and sparking a much needed renaissance. Quote unquote, we think it could be something like Jamestown, said Joe Womack, 68, referred to the early colonial settlement and tourist draw in Virginia, quote unquote, Jamestown and Africa Town. The story of the Clotilda's final voyage began with an Alabama plantation and steamboat owner, Timothy Maher. As tensions between North and South approached a breaking point before the Civil War, Mr. Maher made a wager that he could bring enslaved Africans to the heart of American cotton country, despite a federal ban on importation that had been in effect since 1808. See, this guy, he made a wager, a bet, man, that he could get some of the Israelites, from the west coast of Africa back to Alabama, man, to the shores of Mobile, Alabama, man, which is the Mobile Bay. So reading on, it says the bet grew out of an argument among passengers on one of Mr. Maher's steamship over whether transporting enslaved people from Africa to the United States was still possible. The stakes were high. Such smuggling was punishable by hanging. To avoid detection, the captain of the schooner, William Foster, set the vessel ablaze and sank it after its human cargo was unloaded. Here you see one of the rundown houses of that town in Plateau, known as Africa Town. Flowering vines are reclaiming an abandoned house, one of many in Africa Town. Reading on, it says, the captives were men, women, and children from multiple cultures who spoke multiple languages. They had endured a transatlantic voyage of 45 days, during which they had been stripped of clothing and given only meager daily sips of water. Wow. According to quote unquote Dreams of Africa in Alabama, a book on the subject by the historian Sylvain Anna Diouf, some of the captives were sold upriver. Mr. Maher and his family kept 60 of them. It says they were in a country that was already home to 3.9 million slaves, according to 1860 census figures. In Alabama alone, there were more than 435,000 slaves. The free labor they provided made the state one of the most prodigious cotton producers in the South, where many politicians viewed slavery as a matter to be left up to individual states. In recent decades, the community they eventually funded has suffered steep economic decline. Several nearby mills and industrial plants have died off, including a paper plant that employed hundreds of local people. And I think that was the International Paper Company. It says a self-contained commercial network died with them. Grocery stores, beauty shops, a fish market, service station, and fruit stands all are gone. We're a food desert, quote unquote, said Cleon Jones, 76, the former New York Mets outfielder who grew up in Africa Town and returned in the 1970s after helping lead the team to its storied 1969 World Series victory. He now serves as a kind of unofficial mayor. Mr. Jones said the population has diminished to less than 2,000 from a peak of 12,000 a few decades ago. Lovingly tended little homes abut others that are boarded up, their lots gone to weeds. And this is a picture of the guy that led the voyage to search for the ship, I think. It says Ben Raines, who located the wreck of the Clotilda, he kept searching after another wreck he found in Mobile River in 2018 and thought could be the Clotilda, turned out to be a different ship. A welcome center was destroyed by Hurricane Katrina. Around the corner, a mural painted by a local artist, LeBaron Lewis, depicts the Clotilda gliding underwater under a serene blue sky. The management and guardianship of what remains of the Clotilda now falls to the state of Alabama. The ship is still fully submerged upriver near a place called 12 Mile Island. On Thursday, the day after state's official announced that the ship had been identified, Ben Raines, the documentarian and former journalist who found it, headed toward the island in his motorboat, following the Clotilda's final path. Mr. Raines, 49, and the son of Howell Raines, a former executive editor of the New York Times, announced in January 2018 that he may have discovered the Clotilda. He turned out to be wrong that time, and the story became a source of embarrassment for him. But some of the friends he had made in Africa Town during his expeditions urged him not to quit the search. Thelma Mabin Owens, 66, the director of a community garden in Africa Town, that was the first picture of that lady, that black lady, so-called black lady, put the words of an old church song in his ear, quote unquote, "There's a bright side somewhere. Don't you stop until you find it." Underwater, Mr. Raines headed north, passing the towering cranes at the port of Mobile and then Africa Town until the riverbanks teemed with cypress and saw palmetto, as wild as they must have seemed in 1860. And this is the picture of the little voyage that they took. An Alabama Marine Resources enforcement boat was on duty near the place where Mr. Raines found the ship that experts now agree is the Clotilda. An orange buoy was floating near the place where Mr. Raines found a second ship, the one that experts now agree is the Clotilda. An Alabama Marine Resources enforcement boat was anchored there, and a man was affixing a camera to a tree. It says, Mr. Raines said the wreck was perhaps 5 feet below the surface, only 5 feet below the surface, largely intact and quote unquote cockeyed in the mud. Many of the men and women left on the shore by Mr. Foster had hoped to return to Africa at the end of the Civil War, but their plans proved unworkable and they found themselves stuck. So they established Africa Town, their own American settlement, in either 1866 or 1868. Some families bought land from former slave masters. Mr. Maher, according to Miss Diouf's book, refused to give any land away. They chose as a leader and an African man of noble birth who eventually changed his name to Peter Lee. By the mid-20th century, Africa Town was in full flourish. Mr. Jones and others of his generation described a place where workers walked to their factory jobs and neighbors shared the bounty of red fish and speckled trout caught out of the river. But the pride back then was complicated. Mr. Jones said nothing, that many Americans had distorted views of what it meant to be called, quote unquote, African. Like I say, man, we're not African, man. We are the Israelites that the Bible talk about. You know, people need to come back to your heritage, man. Stop running from it. Read the Bible sometime. It says Jocelyn Davis, 42, is a 6th generation direct descendant of a Clotilda survivor. Quote unquote, Africa had a stigma. He said, quote unquote, I remember going to Pritchard Park as a teenager. The white boys would say, go back to Africa. Quote unquote, my reaction always was, take me back. You brought me over here. Damn right. Jocelyn Davis, 42, is a 6th generation direct descendant of a Clotilda survivor named Charlie Lewis. For years, she said she did not feel like celebrating her family story. Quote unquote, who wants to know you were brought over on a bet, she said. But as she grew older, she read up on her past and on the achievements of the Clotilda survivors, quote unquote, thriving and striving and settling and starting their own homes with less. She said, quote unquote, that builds my sense of pride. That shame has dwindled down to nothing. It says, these days, the neighborhood is a jumble of pride and hardship and hope of celebrating the past and wrestling with it. Mr. Womack is a co-founder of an environmental group and one of numerous Africatown plaintiffs in a lawsuit that accuses International Paper. Yeah, that was the company, the paper company that shut down quite some years ago. The operator of the shuttered power plant of releasing harmful chemicals into the community. The company has denied the wrongdoings, of course. You know, and this is a picture of the grave site that the lady was standing at and offering of fruit left at a memorial to the Africans transported on the Clotilda, the so-called Africans, the Israelites that was transported on the Clotilda. You know, on Thursday afternoon, Miss Mabin Owens, the community garden director, showed the empty lots where the stores used to be, but also gardens, lush in the late spring heat with peas, corn, okra, and sugarcane. She showed a crooked brick chimney, the revered remains of Peter Lee's house. She showed the old cemetery with its big marker commemorating Cujo Kazula Harris, who was on the Clotilda and died in 1935. One of the last of the survivors of the Middle Passage. And she showed the messy lot where the Welcome Center used to be. There are plans for a replacement to be financed by the settlement money from BP after an immense oil spill from an offshore rig in 2010. The new community center, Ms. Mabin Owens said, is where the Clotilda belongs. Quote unquote, nobody talked about that ship until they found it, she said. Quote unquote, now they probably want to put it in Montgomery or something where it has no place being. You know, to me, who cares where it goes, man? You know, we show our history, man, how we got here. It says Dr. Daouf said in an interview on Saturday that the next chapter for the Clotilda might not be settled for years, quote unquote, but hopefully this infamous ship will bring something good to the community, she said, quote unquote. That's the only hope because the ship itself is a ship of horror. Come. Is Maddie McGarvey for the New York Times. Yeah, man. And I think that's pretty much it for the article. So now I'm gonna go into this quick video by the elder brother. And I'm subscribed to this brother's channel. You know, I encourage other brothers and sisters to go and subscribe to his channel too, man. It's called Yahweh Shai is Coming Back. And man, this guy here, man, he has extensive knowledge of the Bible, man. You can really be taught by this guy, man. I'm subscribed. I advise you to subscribe as well. So let's get into the video.
All praise to Yahweh Shai. Double honors to the apostles and elders, great millstone who rule well. Peace and blessings to the elect of Israel. The name of this lesson is going to be entitled, The Kingdom of Judah Sold into Slavery from West Africa. And the kingdom of Judah are Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. Okay? These three tribes dwelt predominantly in West Africa during the slave trade. Okay? And that's why you had a port, a slave port in Benin, which is in Africa, which was before that it was called Dahomey, and you had a lot of slaves sold from Dahomey.
Right.
Okay, and it was so many slaves sold from there, they actually called it the Slave Coast. Okay, and one of the cities or one of the towns they had in Dahomey, which is called Benin today, one of the places they had there, or the cities they had there, it was called Ouida, which really is Judah. Okay, and it was also called the Kingdom of Judah, and it was called Ouida by the French. Okay, you know, and the French colonized that that side of Africa. Okay, but this is all according to prophecy. And I looked at a lot of different information pertaining to the slave trade, and during that time when the slave trade occurred, the transatlantic slave trade, when it happened, and when it took place in Benin, which was called Dahomey, the different kings that they had during that time. I mean, it's hard to find everything out in detail, but it's my belief that they were Hamites, because they would say that they wouldn't sell their own people. Some of them said that they tried to stop the slave trade, but they still did it. They still took part in it, and they said that they wouldn't sell their own people.
That's right.
That they knew that they were Hamites, and they knew that the people that they were selling were Israelites. Okay, all right. It just only makes sense.
In the Ashanti kingdom, most likely were they not in high positions and stuff like that? Were they not Israelites that sold out there back then too?
Which the head speaker in Atlanta, he made a point. You had Israelites that were traitors, that would be on the side of the Hamites, and that would be down with us going to slavery, So, I mean, this is nothing new with a lot of our people being in league with the heathen, okay? That's been happening for a long time, man. All right, it happened in the book of Maccabees. It's happened all throughout history. But I'm going to read a few scriptures, and I'm going to play these clips. All right, but this is just going to show that, hey, man, we are that people, man. It's been proven time and again through the scriptures, and brothers have been going through the history. But this is something I wanted to do because I rarely touch on the kingdom of Judah. The southern kingdom. I rarely go into it, okay? This is Joel chapter 3, verse 3. And they have cast lots for my people, and have given a boy for an harlot, and sold a girl for wine that they might drink. All right? And this is going into those oxen blocks, all right? Yea, and what have ye to do with me, O Tyre and Zidon, and all the coasts of Palestine? Now, Tyre and Zidon, those are Hamites, okay? And even Palestine, those were Hamites too, but the people that dwell in Palestine today are Arabs, all right? So the Arabs also took part in the slave trade. So the Hamites took part in selling us, and also the Arabs, okay? Will ye render me a recompense? And if you recompense me swiftly and speedily, will I return your recompense upon your own head? Because ye have taken my silver and my gold, and have carried it into your temples my goodly pleasant things. Yeah, they took all our gold and silver, all right, that we had in our temple. The children also of Judah and the children of Jerusalem have ye sold unto the Grecians, that ye might remove them far from their border. So yeah, those damn Hamites, they sold us to the French, they sold us to the English, they sold us to the Portuguese, all right? That's what happened, man. All right, and you had the Arabs that took part in that too. Okay, you had Arabs that were selling us. Well, first you had the Africans, the Hamites, selling us to the Arabs, which are Ishmaelites. Okay, and it says the children of Judah and the children of Jerusalem, which would be Benjamin and Levi. Okay, so Judah, Benjamin, and Levi were sold into slavery unto the Grecians, which are the Greeks, which are so-called white people, man. Okay, because when the so-called white man first came into power, he came into power as the Greeks, Alexander the Greek. Okay, that you might remove them far from their border, and that's what happened. All right, we ended up in America. Okay, but it was all prophecy that happened. All right. Now this is Revelation chapter 12, verse 6. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of the Most High, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. So the woman represents Israel. All right, you go to the top here, it speaks about a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet. basically representing knowledge and wisdom. And upon her head, a crown of 12 stars. The 12 stars represent the 12 tribes of Israel. All right, so the woman is Israel. She fled into the wilderness. She fled into Africa. All right, the wilderness represents Africa, where she had a place prepared of the Most High. That place prepared of the Most High is America. So we went. All right, we went into Africa. We left out of the land of Israel. We fled into Africa. Okay, and also the interiors of Europe, but mainly Africa. Okay, and then we came to America, and we will be in America for 1,203 square days, which really represents, well, it's 3.5 years, but it represents 350 years that we would be in slavery. Okay, all right, that they should feed her there. So Esau took care of us in slavery. All right, but now we woke up to this truth, man. And this was the worst slavery that ever took place in history, man. All right, and the scriptures speak about it. This is Daniel chapter 9, verse 12. And he hath confirmed his words, which he spake against us and against our judges that judged us, by bringing upon us a great evil. For under the whole heaven hath not been done as hath been done upon Jerusalem. So this is the worst slavery that ever took place in history, man. Under the whole heaven. All right, but it's so much proof, man, that we are the Israelites, man. Okay, it's like you have the Igbo tribe in Nigeria. Igbo is like saying Ibar, which is Hebrew. Okay, Igbo is just like a corrupted way of saying Ibar, which means from the past, which is Hebrew. Okay. And then you see certain slavery signs, it'll say Hebo, because the English couldn't pronounce that word, Ebo, so they would say Hebo, which is like saying Hebrew. Okay, so it's just so much proof, man, that we are that people. All right, and the slave port Ouida, which really is Judah. It was so many slaves sold from there, man, that it was called the Slave Coast. Okay, but I'm gonna play these clips, man, proving that the Hamites know that they sold the different people. They didn't sell their own people, and also the Arabs took place in this slave trade also.
That's right.
And Agonglo was said to be one of the kings who tried to stop slave trade. But of course he did not succeed.
But he must have known how bad it was.
Yes, they knew how bad it was. That was why they didn't trade their own people. They would trade people from the wars and battles they did all around the country.
Okay, it's a hot day today, and we're about to go over this road, and what they're saying, this is the road of where the slaves went, the road of no return. So, Nini, just tell us some things about where we're about to go.
Okay, we go to the ocean where they put the slaves in the ships, but the slaves came from the interior. They were bought from the chiefs, from the kings in the interior, and the king got in return cannons and weapons.
Wow. And so literally they were walking this way to get on the ship. And can you imagine the things in which they were thinking going through their head, going to the ship, and this is a place of no return?
Pour toute l'Afrique,
for all the Africa,
il y a 4 ports.
for all the in all Africa, they have 4 gates. The population of the slave that went out here through this gate was the most slaves.
When they did not have enough chains, they cut a tree, they made a log out of it, and they cut 3 holes in it.
Came from.
And they put 3 holes, and they put the log on top of their head, so that the 3 stay together, walk together behind each other.
Over side by side?
600 walked side by side.
You know, it's like an arrow. It means that this road that you come through, it have only one entry. That is no returning back. Is the unknown destination. During that road here, all sorts of things happen with the slaves. They can sleep with them, they can beat them, they can do so many things there. Violence.
On peut dire l'abolition en 1848. Et en 1846, c'est le dernier bateau.
The last ship went on 1846, and it was then they don't got any other ship came in for slavery.
Sur les 4 poteaux, il y a hommes et femmes qui sont en genoux.
In all this, you see men and women, men and women, you know, in the forts.
They put a tatouage, they burn it in the back here. The name of the master.
When they do that, they cry. So they go now and buy some iron to close their mouths.
Close their mouths.
Yeah, that's why their mouth is.
The success of Muhammadan Islam in deceiving, misinforming, deforming, and contorting both history and reality over a period of almost 1400 years has been astounding. That is, until now. The greatest tragedy about this particular subject is that most of the descendants of African slavery, the black people in the Americas, around the world, as well as among the African blacks, are totally ignorant of the actual facts. Before we lose the concentration of our listeners, I would like to make the following statement and then prove it. That the worst, most inhumane and most diabolical institution of the black African slave trade was initiated, refined, perpetrated, and implemented by the Mohammedan Arabs and later aided and abetted by the black converts to Mohammedan Islam. In fact, the very word slavery has its root in the name Slav, based upon the Slavic peoples of Europe who were subjugated by other Europeans. It is not common knowledge that the Arabic word abd is synonymous with the meaning of slave. For example, Abdullah means literally the slave of Allah, and that in the language of the Arabs, all black peoples are called abid, plural, for slaves. While much has been written concerning the transatlantic slave trade, surprisingly little attention has been paid to the Islamic slave trade across the Sahara, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean. While the European involvement in the African transatlantic slave trade to the Americas lasted for just over 3 centuries, the Arab involvement in the African slave trade has lasted 14 centuries. The birth of Mohammedan Islam and its conquests brought about the birth of institutionalized, systematized, and religiously sanctioned slave trade on a massive and global scale. In fact, the Quran allows the taking of slaves as booty or reward for wars of aggression against any and all unbelievers. Incredible and heinous abuses have occurred throughout the history of Mohammedan Islam. By the Middle Ages, the Arabic word abid was in general used to denote a black slave. Ibn Khaldun, 1332 to 1406, the preeminent Islamic medieval historian and social thinker, wrote, "The Negro nations are, as a rule, submissive to slavery because they have attributes that are quite similar to dumb animals." It should also be noted that black slaves were castrated based on the assumption that the blacks had an ungovernable sexual appetite. When the Fatimid Caliphate came to power in Egypt, they slaughtered all the tens of thousands of black military slaves and raised an entirely new slave army. Some of these slaves were conscripted into the army at age 10.
From Persia to Egypt to Morocco, slave armies from 30,000 to up to 250,000 became commonplace. The Islamic slave trade took place across the Sahara Desert, from the coast of the Red Sea, and from East Africa across the Indian Ocean. The Trans-Sahara trade was conducted along 6 major slave routes. A comparison of the Islamic slave trade to the American slave trade reveals some extremely interesting contrasts. While 2 out of every 3 slaves shipped across the Atlantic were men, the proportions were reversed in the Islamic slave trade. 2 women for every man were enslaved by the Muslims. While the mortality rate of slaves being transported across the Atlantic was as high as 10%, the percentage of slaves dying in transit in the Trans-Sahara and East African slave market was a staggering 80 to 90%. While almost all the slaves shipped across the Atlantic were for agricultural work, most of the slaves destined for the Muslim Middle East were for sexual exploitation as concubines in harems and for military service. While many children were born to the slaves in the Americas, the millions of their descendants are citizens in Brazil and the United States of today. Very few descendants of the slaves that ended up in the Middle East survived. While most slaves who went to the Americas could marry and have families, most of the male slaves destined for the Middle East were castrated, and most of the children born to the women were killed at birth. It is estimated that possibly as many as 11 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic, 95% of which went to South and Central America, mainly to Portuguese, Spanish, and French possessions. Only 5% of the slaves ended up in what we call the United States today. However, a minimum of 28 million Africans were enslaved in the Muslim Middle East.
So, that's the end of the video. And man, that's right, man. We're not Africans. We're the Hebrew Israelites that the Bible speak of, man. Call Allah Yamlah, Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahweh. All praise to the Heavenly Father Yahweh, in the name of his only begotten Son, Yahweh Shah, and in the name of the Holy Spirit. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone who teach this truth 100%. Peace, blessing, salutations to the hopeful elect. Shalom.